Welcome back. Deadwood, August 1903. The Black Hills are slick with a cold rain as a meager procession trudges through the thick mud of Mount Moriah Cemetery. They're here to bury a legend, or perhaps a ghost. Martha Jane Cannary, known to the world as the notorious Calamity Jane, is finally being lowered into the damp earth. But the real mystery isn't inside her coffin. It is found in the plot just inches away, the grave of Wild Bill Hickok. Why is a notorious drunkard and a self-confessed liar buried beside the West's most legendary Prince of Pistols? The answer lies beneath decades of carefully crafted illusions and a one-sided obsession that refused to stay buried. To understand the chaos that eventually consumed her, we must look back at the cracks in the foundation. The legend of Calamity Jane wasn't born in a gunfight. It was forged in the desperate squalor of Princeton, Missouri. In 1852, this was the frontier of hope, but inside the Cannary household, it was a slow-motion wreck. Martha Jane Cannary didn't grow up with bedtime stories. She grew up with the rhythmic, suffocating tension of a family falling apart. Her father, Robert Wilson Cannary, was less of a farmer and more of a ghost, haunting the local gambling dens. In the mid-19th century, a father's addiction wasn't just a private shame. It was a death sentence for the family's social standing. Every lost hand at the card table was a meal taken directly from his children's mouths. This was the poverty trap in its most brutal form. While the Victorian era preached the sanctity of the domestic sphere, the Cannary home was a structure built on shifting sand. Her mother, Charlotte M. Cannary, faced an impossible choice: watch her 6 children starve or find a way to monetize her own presence. Some historical accounts suggest Charlotte was forced into the shadows of the unsavory trade, working as a prostitute, just to keep the family from total collapse. Imagine the psychological toll on a young girl watching her mother compromise her soul while her father gambled away the scraps in a nearby saloon. This environment didn't just breed poverty. It bred a specific kind of internal instability. For Martha, the world was a place where those meant to protect you were the first to fail. Her later brutal reputation, the heavy drinking, the loud, aggressive persona, it wasn't just a personality. It was a suit of armor. She was a child who realized far too early that if she didn't become a character, she would simply disappear into the dirt. She looked at the men around her. They had the guns, the whiskey, and the freedom. And she realized that being a lady in the 1850s was synonymous with being a victim. She made her choice before she was even 10 years old. By 1865, the family decided to flee their failures, joining a wagon train headed for Virginia City, Montana. But the trail is a brutal judge of the weak. During the 5-month trek, the grueling conditions claimed her mother. Charlotte died of pneumonia on the road, leaving the family adrift in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The journey continued to Salt Lake City, but within a year, her father, Robert, also passed away. Suddenly, the 14-year-old Martha Jane was standing at the edge of the world with 5 younger siblings and a wagon full of nothing. This is where the child died and the survivor was born. While other girls her age were being fitted for corsets and learning to embroider, Martha was mastering the logistics of life and death. She didn't have the luxury of grief. She became a child general, leading a retreat of orphans across the rugged terrain toward Fort Bridger, Wyoming. She was no longer a girl. She was a provider, a protector, and a ghost of the frontier. It was here that she first reached for a man's coat and trousers. This wasn't a grand statement of gender identity. It was a survival tactic. In the lawless West, a lone girl was a target. A laborer in buckskins was a worker. She took on the most grueling, ruthless jobs available: driving ox teams, washing grease-stained dishes, and cooking for rough crews in camps where a soft word could get you killed. She realized that in a world of men, you either became one of them or you were crushed by them. She was hardening herself, brick by brick, matching the callousness of the frontier. She learned to ride, to shoot, and most importantly, to lie with a straight face. The Calamity hadn't been named yet, but the girl who could be hurt was gone. She was now a creature of the trail, an unsavory character in the making, ready to do whatever was necessary to keep herself and her siblings alive. She was brawling with life itself, and she was starting to win. Or at least, she was starting to fight back. The foundation was laid. Martha Jane had learned that truth was a luxury she couldn't afford, and that a well-told lie could be just as protective as a loaded gun. It was this realization that would eventually lead her to the muddy streets of Deadwood and into the path of a man who lived by the pistol. The stage was set for the meeting that would define her legend, but first, she had to invent the woman the world would come to fear and admire. By 1870, the orphaned survivor of the Montana Trail had fully shed her past. Martha Jane was gone. In her place stood a figure that seemed to belong more to the pages of a dime novel than to reality. This was the era of the military mirage, a period where our subject claimed to have been at the very center of the American Indian Wars, serving as a daring scout for the likes of George Armstrong Custer and George Crook. In her own autobiography, she paints a cinematic picture of herself, donning the blue uniform, riding into the jaws of death, and outmaneuvering ruthless warriors with the skill of a veteran soldier. But when we apply a scientific approach to these claims, much like the forensic investigators at Scotland Yard, the facade begins to crumble. Military records from the 1870s are meticulous, documenting every scout, every pay voucher, and every irregular civilian employee. And yet, the name Martha Jane Cannary is conspicuously absent from the official logs of Custer's expeditions. Why would she construct such a massive, verifiable lie? To understand this, we have to look at the social hierarchy of the frontier. In the 1870s, the West was an exclusive club for men, and the military was its inner sanctum. For a woman with an insatiable desire for agency and safety, a seat at that table was worth any price. By claiming the status of a scout, she wasn't just telling a story. She was acquiring a social shield. She was transforming herself from an unsavory drifter into a national asset. It was a brilliant, if desperate, psychological gambit. She understood that in a world obsessed with heroes, people would rather believe a magnificent lie than look at the gruesome reality of a woman who had nowhere else to go. This leads us to the most famous chapter of her self-creation, the baptism by Goose Creek. According to her own legend, it was 1872 in Wyoming. A military column was ambushed, and Captain Egan was shot from his horse. In her telling, Jane gallops back through a hail of bullets, hoists the wounded officer onto her saddle, and carries him to safety. It is here, she claims, that Egan looks at her and declares, "I name you Calamity Jane, the heroine of the plains." It's a perfect punchline to a heroic origin story. But like so many gruesome stories of the era, the facts tell a different tale. Historical analysis suggests Captain Egan had no record of such an incident, and the geography of the skirmish doesn't align with her presence. So, where did the name truly come from? There are two other much more unsavory theories. The first is a warning that she told men that to offend her was to court calamity. The second, and perhaps the most relatable, is that her very presence brought misfortune, a calamity to any man or camp she joined due to her volatile nature and heavy drinking. Regardless of the truth, the name stuck, and in a strange twist of fate, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By adopting the mask of Calamity Jane, she committed herself to a life of perpetual chaos. She had successfully banned her past and replaced it with a brand that the public was eager to consume. But a mask that is worn too long eventually becomes the face. She had invented a heroine to escape a victim, but in doing so, she ensured that she would never be able to live a quiet life again. She was now a character in a drama of her own making, drifting toward a lawless gold mining camp in the Black Hills, where her path would finally cross with the most notorious gunman of the age. The military Mirage had served its purpose. It gave her the notoriety she needed to enter Deadwood, not as a camp follower, but as a legend in her own right. But as we will see, the dead man's hand was already being dealt, and even the most carefully crafted mask couldn't protect her from the tragedy that was about to unfold in Saloon Number. Démete. While the myths of the early frontier often paint a picture of solitary heroes, the reality of the Black Hills Gold Rush was a chaotic convergence of the desperate and the damned. By the spring of 1876, the trail to Deadwood had become a vein of humanity pulsing through the dangerous Sioux territory, and it was here, in the shadow of Fort Laramie, that the trajectory of Jane's life would collide with a legend that was already beginning to fade. The air at the fort was thick with the scent of wet livestock and the acrid smoke of low-grade tobacco. Among the hundreds of fortune seekers, one figure stood out with an almost supernatural gravity. He was a man whose reputation preceded him like a thunderclap: Wild Bill Hickok. By this stage of his life, Hickok was a man looking for a quiet score, his eyes failing him, his nerves frayed by years of living at the end of a gun barrel. But to the crowd, he was still the Prince of Pistoliers. It was within this high-tension environment that the wagon train organized by Charlie Utter, known to all as Colorado Charlie, began to take shape. Utter was a meticulous man, a professional who kept his hair long and his clothes clean even in the mud of the trail. He had gathered a group that the newspapers would later describe as a caravan of outcasts. And right there, in the middle of the dirt and the bravado, was Calamity Jane. The journey from Fort Laramie to the Black Hills was not a heroic march. It was a grueling, booze-soaked crawl through a landscape that wanted them dead. Jane was no longer the girl in the soldier's uniform. She was a hard-drinking, foul-mouthed fixture of the camp. She traveled with the sporting women, the prostitutes and camp followers who provided the only comfort to be found on the edge of the world. Yet, she found herself gravitated toward the inner circle of Wild Bill Hickok and Charlie Utter. There is a distinct atmosphere to these long nights on the trail. Imagine the sound of the wind howling across the plains, the rhythmic creak of the heavy wagons, and the low murmur of men who knew they were trespassing on sacred Indian land. Jane lived for this tension. She claimed a proximity to Bill that few others dared. In her later memoirs, she would paint this journey as a romantic prelude, a time when she and Bill were inseparable. She would even go so far as to call it a marriage in the eyes of the frontier. But the reality was likely much more somber. Hickok, suffering from glaucoma and seeking a final payday in the goldfields, likely saw Jane as a colorful, perhaps tragic, companion of the road. A woman who could outdrink and outcurse any man in the outfit. The friendship was forged in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. As the caravan wound its way through the Cheyenne River and into the dark, timbered gulches of Deadwood, the bond between the dying legend and the rising mythmaker became the only anchor Jane had left. They arrived in the lawless camp in July, a place where the sun rarely hit the bottom of the canyon, and where the air was thick with the promise of gold and the stench of impending violence. The transition from the open trail to the claustrophobic confines of Deadwood changed everything. The town was a jagged scar of raw timber and mud, a place where civilization hadn't yet root, but vice was already in full bloom. Jane and Bill were now part of the local scenery, two relics of a dying West trying to find their footing in a town that moved too fast. But as the heat of August began to settle over the gulch, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to a stagnant, predatory stillness. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1876, the air inside Saloon Number 10 was cool, but it carried the heavy, sweet smell of spilled beer and unwashed bodies. It was just past noon, a time when the serious gamblers were usually still asleep. But Wild Bill Hickok was already at the tables. In a rare and fatal lapse of judgment, Bill was sitting with his back to the door. For years he had been obsessive about sitting in a corner where he could watch the entrance, but today, the only seat available in the high-stakes game of five-card draw was the one that left him vulnerable. He had asked the other players to switch, but they had laughed it off. Bill stayed. He was holding a hand that would soon pass into the realm of the occult, a pair of black aces and a pair of black eights. The fifth card remained a mystery, lost to history the moment the silence of the room was shattered. A drifter named Jack McCall, a man described as having a shifty, cross-eyed look and a head too small for his shoulders, walked through the swinging doors with a purposeful, quiet gait. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a nobody. He walked slowly behind Bill, his hand reaching for a .45 caliber Sharps revolver tucked into his coat. The violence was instantaneous. McCall raised the pistol to within inches of the back of Hickok's head and screamed, "Damn you, take that!" The muzzle flash lit up the dim corner of the saloon. The bullet entered the back of Bill's skull, passing through the brain with such velocity that it exited through his cheek and struck another player, Yash, Captain Massey, in the wrist. Hickok didn't even have time to reach for his legendary ivory-handled revolvers. He simply slumped forward, his head hitting the table, the cards slipping from his lifeless fingers onto the sawdust floor. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of pure, unadulterated shock. The world's greatest gunfighter had been snuffed out by a coward's bullet in a dingy room over a game of pennies. The dead man's hand, the aces and eights, lay scattered around his body, a grim signature of the frontier's random brutality. As the smoke cleared and the screams began to erupt, the legend of Wild Bill Hickok ended, and the dark, distorted legend of Calamity Jane's revenge began to take its first breath. While the saloon was descending into a maelstrom of panic, Jane was nowhere near the scene of the crime. She was likely blocks away, perhaps in a nearby tent or another bar, unaware that the center of her universe had just been obliterated. But in the years that followed, Jane would recount a version of the events that would make any dime novel writer blush with envy. According to Jane's own account, the moment she heard the shot, she sprang into action like a vengeful Valkyrie. She claimed she cornered Jack McCall in a local butcher shop. In her version, she didn't have her pistols on her, so she grabbed the nearest weapon available, a heavy, blood-stained meat cleaver. She swore she chased the trembling assassin through the streets of Deadwood, waving the cleaver and threatening to butcher him like a hog until the authorities arrived to take him away. It is a powerful image. It is the image of a woman so driven by love and loyalty that she would face down a killer with nothing but a kitchen tool. But when we turn to the cold, hard facts of the legal record, the story of the meat cleaver evaporates like mist. The trial of Jack McCall was a farce of frontier justice. He was initially acquitted by a minors' court after claiming Bill had killed his brother, a claim that was later proven to be a total fabrication. Throughout the entire proceeding, through the capture of McCall in a local restaurant and his subsequent flight from town, there is not a single mention of Calamity Jane. The men who actually apprehended McCall were local lawmen and angry miners. Jane was, by all reliable accounts, paralyzed by grief or simply absent, lost in the shadows of a town that was already moving on. This discrepancy reveals the true tragedy of Jane's life. The Cleaver legend wasn't just a lie. It was a desperate act of revisionist history. She couldn't live with the reality that she wasn't there to save him. She couldn't bear the thought that the man she called her husband had died alone, surrounded by strangers, while she was elsewhere. By inventing the meat cleaver story, Jane inserted herself into the climax of the story. She turned her powerlessness into a moment of cinematic defiance. It was the first major brick in the wall of the Calamity Jane persona, a wall built to hide a woman who was increasingly isolated by her own trauma and the harsh reality that in the real West, there were no heroes to catch you when you fell. The trial of McCall would eventually move to Yankton, where he would be hanged for his crime. But for Jane, the trial never ended. She would spend the rest of her life trying to prove she was the woman the legend demanded her to be. The echoing crack of the bullet that took Wild Bill Hickok was still ringing in the ears of the mountain when a new, far more ruthless killer arrived in the Black Hills. By 1878, Deadwood was no longer just a haven for unsavory characters and desperate miners. It had become a pressure cooker of infection. While the gold-fevered energy of the camp was insatiable, the biological reality of frontier life was about to catch up with the dream. This was the year of the speckled monster, the smallpox epidemic that would test the very DNA of every soul in the gulch. Smallpox was a vicious and gruesome way to die. It didn't care about your bank account or your prowess with a pistol. It began with a high, soul-crushing fever and a backache that felt like being broken on a rack. Then came the eruption of pustules that could turn a human being into a weeping, unrecognizable mass of contagion. In a town like Deadwood, described at the time as a cacophony of filth, where sanitation was non-existent and horse-drawn vehicles churned filth into the streets, the disease spread with a terrifying speed. As the first cases appeared, the true character of the town's respectable elite was laid bare. The merchants, the moralists, and the wealthy claim holders who had looked down their noses at the drunks in the gutter were the first to pack their bags. Panic is a powerful disinfectant for hypocrisy. The town's doctors were overwhelmed, and a makeshift quarantine camp, known as the Pest House, was established on a remote hillside. It was a place of isolation, a place where people were sent to die in the dark, away from the eyes of the living. It is within this landscape of gruesome suffering that we see a dramatic shift in the narrative of a Jane Cannary. Since the death of Bill, Jane had been living as a pariah. She was the town drunk, an unsavory nuisance frequently arrested for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. She was the woman the decent people crossed the street to avoid. But as the doors of the moral houses were locked and the streets emptied of the cowardly, Jane did something that defied all logic of self-preservation. She walked directly into the pest house. She didn't have a scientific approach to medicine. She didn't understand the realm of forensic science or the biological mechanisms of the virus. What she had was a total lack of fear, likely born from a woman who felt she had already survived the worst the world could offer. Jane became the only person willing to touch the untouchables. She took up residence in the quarantine tents, surrounded by the stench of rot and the groans of those who had been abandoned by their own families. Witness accounts from survivors provide a cinematic contrast to her public persona. One miner recalled how Jane, usually known for her coarse cursing and whiskey-soaked bravado, sat by his bedside for 3 nights without sleep. Her rough, calloused hands, the hands of a mule skinner and a scout, were surprisingly tender as she sponged the fever from his brow and applied poultices to his sores. She wasn't doing this for the cameras or for a dime novel contract. There was no gold in the pest house, only death. This was the Angel of Deadwood era, a title that seems almost impossible when viewed against her unsavory record. But the records of the local community, from those who were shocked to the core by the brutality of the disease, confirm her presence. She spent her own meager earnings on groceries and medicine for the sick. When the local authorities were too terrified to deliver supplies to the quarantine line, it was Jane who emerged from the tents to demand what was needed for her patients. Why did she do it? To understand her motives, we must look at the unquenchable need for purpose that had driven her since she was a 14-year-old orphan in Montana. In the pest house, the mask of the legend wasn't necessary. The smallpox didn't care about her lies or her fictional marriages. In the presence of death, Jane was finally real. The child general who had saved her siblings on the trail had returned, but this time her army was made of the dying and the forgotten. It was a raw, visceral act of redemption for a woman who lived her life as a vicious performance. But the most gruesome part of this story is what happened after the epidemic began to wane. Once the danger had passed and the streets of Deadwood were safe again, the respectable citizens returned. They were happy to have used the unsavory drunk to nurse their children back to health. But once the crisis was over, she was no longer an angel. She was once more a nuisance. The social barriers were re-erected, and Jane was pushed back into the gutters of the mining camp. This rejection triggered a new wave of insatiable self-destruction. The gratitude of the few she saved wasn't enough to anchor her in a society that only valued her when they were terrified. She returned to the saloons, her storytelling becoming more frantic and exaggerated as she tried to reclaim the sense of importance she had found in the quarantine tents. She had looked into the abyss of a vicious plague and found her own humanity, only to have the world tell her that it didn't count. The Angel in the Dust episode is the most authentic piece of her DNA. It proves that beneath the coarsened exterior and the fabricated legends, there was a core of deep, desperate compassion. She was a woman of extremes, a vicious liar and a saintly nurse, a character in a dime novel and a hero in a plague ward. As the 1880s approached, the Old West was being measured and categorized, and the frontier Jane knew was disappearing. She was a relic of a wilder time, a ghost moving toward a new century that had no place for calamity unless it was sold as entertainment. The transition from the pest house back to the saloons marked the beginning of her long, slow fade to black. She was about to enter a period of domestic illusion, a desperate attempt to find a normal life that would only lead to more unsavory failures and a deepening obsession with the only man she believed ever truly understood her, even if he had been dead for years. By the 1880s, the Angel of Deadwood had once again transformed. But this wasn't a transformation of growth. It was a forensic case of identity fraud. To understand this era, we have to look past the buckskins and investigate the systematic creation of a domestic illusion. Martha Jane Cannary began to realize that the raw, gritty reality of her life was no longer enough to sustain her. She needed a narrative that gave her a seat at the table of respectability. This led to the case of the missing records. Jane began claiming she had married a man named Clinton Burke in 1885 and had given birth to a daughter, Janie. She spoke of a quiet life on a ranch, a complete departure from her disreputable past. However, a scientific approach to the archives of the era tells a different story. There are no marriage licenses, no birth certificates, no legal paper trail that proves Clinton Burke was anything more than a temporary companion in a life of unquenchable wandering. The mystery deepens when we analyze the Calamity Jane diaries. These letters, supposedly written by Jane to her daughter, are the most famous pieces of evidence in the pro-Hickok marriage theory. They describe a secret union with a Wild Bill Hickok and a tragic sacrifice for her child. But when we apply a realm of forensic science to these documents, the forgery is laid bare. The writing style and the historical details are riddled with contradictions that a woman of Jane's background, who was known to be illiterate, could never have produced. It was a sophisticated psychological shield, likely crafted decades later to give the legend a heart it never actually possessed. The tragedy of this identity fraud reached its climax when Jane was recruited for 8 Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. By now, the American West was being ushering in as a new form of entertainment. The frontier was officially closed, and the public was insatiable for a caricature of the wild life. Jane was hired to play herself. Imagine the pathos of this situation. A woman who had survived the grueling reality of the trail and the grime of the pest houses was now being paid to perform a sanitized, cinematic version of her own trauma. She was a relic of the 19th century being showcased to a 20th century audience that had never seen real blood. It was a brutal humiliation, but Jane was not a stage performer. She was a survivor of the dirt. Her relentless alcoholism made her a liability to the scientific precision of the show. She was frequently fired for public intoxication and for getting into brawls with other performers who viewed her as a scandalous nuisance. The Prince of Showmen, Buffalo Bill Cody, eventually had to let her go for good after a series of disruptive outbursts. The final dissolve occurred in 1901 at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. In a city celebrating the dawn of electricity and global progress, Jane was an unsavory ghost of a forgotten era. She was arrested for firing her revolver in the streets, a desperate act to reclaim a relevance that had long since evaporated. She wasn't just a drunk. She was a woman whose DNA was so intertwined with a vanishing world that she couldn't exist in the light of the new one. She had spent years fabricating a family and a marriage to escape the grim reality of her isolation. But by the time she was expelled from the exposition, she had nothing left but the bottle and the myth. She was a sideshow attraction that the world had outgrown, drifting toward the only place where her lies still carried the weight of truth. She was headed back to the Black Hills, moving toward a final stop where the mask would finally meet the dirt. The investigation into the end of V.E. Martha Jane Cannary doesn't lead to a grand battlefield or a heroic last stand. Instead, it concludes in a cramped, drafty room at the Callaway Hotel in the mining town of Terry, South Dakota. By the summer of 1903, the woman who had spent decades outrunning her own reality had finally run out a road. This was the final stop in a case defined by survival and the relentless pursuit of a myth that was never quite true. A forensic look at the scene reveals a woman stripped of the buckskins and the bravado. There was no cinematic glory in this hotel room. Martha Jane was suffering from a brutal combination of pneumonia and inflammation of the bowels, the stark biological tax of a lifetime of unquenchable alcoholism. She was 51 years old, though witnesses noted she looked closer to 80. The only person of note by her side was Dora Dufron, the local madam who had hired Jane as a laundress when the rest of the world had turned its back on the scandalous relic of the 1870s. On August 1st, 1903, exactly 27 years to the day after she had arrived in Deadwood with the legendary Wild Bill Hickok, Jane's pulse finally stopped. Her death wasn't a tragedy for the town. It was the closing of a disreputable file. But even in her final moments, she managed one last act of narrative manipulation. She whispered a request to be buried in Mount Moriah Cemetery, specifically in the plot directly beside Wild Bill. The funeral was one of the largest the Black Hills had ever seen. But we must not mistake the crowd for mourners. While hundreds followed the casket up the steep, muddy path, many were there out of a morbid curiosity to see the end of an era. Then came the biting irony of the burial itself. The men who organized the plot, the respectable survivors of the 1876 gold rush, didn't place her next to Bill out of respect for her supposed marriage. They did it as a savage post-mortem joke. These pioneers decided that since Wild Bill Hickok had spent his final months in Deadwood trying to escape the chaotic presence of Jane, they would play a trick on him for all of eternity. They buried her there to guard him, knowing the two had never been the lovers Jane claimed they were. It was an act of frontier humor meant to mock her obsession, yet it became the very thing that cemented her into the foundation of American history. The joke backfired. By placing her beside the Prince of Pistoliers, the citizens of Deadwood accidentally granted Martha Jane Cannary the ultimate immortality. Today, their graves are the center of a thriving tourist industry. You cannot mention one without the other. She successfully convicted history of her importance, proving that a well-crafted lie can be more enduring than the cold, hard truth. The case of Calamity Jane ends here, in the dirt of Mount Moriah, where the mask and the woman finally became one. She was a pioneer of personal branding who understood that in a world of men, you had to become a legend to keep from being forgotten. The dead man's hand had been played. The scientific century had arrived. But the ghost of the girl from Missouri had managed to have the last laugh. The file on bummer Martha Jane Cannary is not a biography. It is a forensic deconstruction of the greatest identity fraud in the history of the frontier. We began with a vicious murder in Deadwood and ended with a woman who lied her way into a grave beside the victim. When we apply a scientific approach to her claims, the military scout and the avenging angel evaporate, leaving behind a survivor who used storytelling as her only weapon against a world that tried to crush her. The case of Calamity Jane proves that in the lawless West, a well-crafted myth was more unyielding than the truth. By forcing her way into Wild Bill Hickok's final resting place, she successfully convicted history of her importance. The post-mortem joke played by the citizens of Deadwood backfired, granting her the very immortality she had spent her life manufacturing. Thank you for joining us as we investigated the smoke and mirrors of the Black Hills. If you found this case compelling, make sure to like and subscribe as we continue to turn over the most notorious files in history. Until next time.